The sound of Claire's voice is the first thing I still hear when I close my eyes, years later, like a siren that never quite lets me sleep. She was screaming so loud the neighbors came out on their lawns, and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the jewelry box open to show the empty velvet. She jabbed a finger at me like a blade and said words that rearranged my life in an instant. I remember thinking, even as my chest filled with that particular kind of cold panic, that whatever came after would not be small. It would be loud, it would be public, and it would try to be final. I could not have known the brooch would end up in a thrift store coat pocket 3 towns over, or that a plumber would find it wrapped around a towel in a basement pipe like some misplaced relic. I could not have known that later, strangers would hand me jobs and second chances, and that my sister's story would fray into something ugly she could not stitch back together. All I knew then was Claire pointing at me and the room tilting. The living room looked like an argument had tried to rearrange our furniture. Cushions slumped, a coffee cup tipped over and stained the rug, and the little tray where Mom kept her jewelry sat open like a crime scene. Claire's voice kept replaying timestamps, ridiculous details she could not have known if she had not planned them. She said she saw me in the hall at 10:17, that I had left the room after she went to the kitchen for tea, and that when she came back the brooch was gone and I had been the last one near Mom's things. She named the brooch, the one with the cloudy sapphire and the tiny diamonds, the way you name a dead person. Her eyes were wet but sharp. She wasn't stumbling over facts, she was rehearsing them. It was the look of someone who wanted a verdict, not a truth. My mother clutched the cardigan my father left on the armchair and started crying, and my father did that small mechanical thing men do when they think they are protecting the house by choosing a side. No one asked me what I was doing that morning. No one asked where my keys were. No one asked for proof. They wanted a story to hold because stories are easier than the messy truth. When I opened my mouth to protest, the words came out thin and useless. Claire kept speaking over me, filling the room with catalog details as if naming the moments would make them solid. She accused me in front of old relatives who had come for Sunday lunch, in front of neighbors who had known me since I was a kid, in front of friends who had once thought my laugh was part of the family soundtrack. Shade fell across my face in the kind of way that makes you want to hide even from yourself. My sister had been the golden child for as long as I could remember. She got the AS, the applause, the extra helpings at holidays, the space to be dramatic. Her version of events landed easier on my parents because it fit the pattern they had liked to watch. In the space of an hour, I was not a son, I was a problem to be removed. They told me to pack a bag, they told me I could not stay. They said it kindly at first, then with the small cruel efficiency of people who have decided on a verdict and see no need to explain the jury's reasons. Packing felt like collecting evidence that I had once existed. I shoved shirts into a duffel, crammed my textbooks and the small heap of unpaid bills into a shopping bag, and tried to keep my hands from shaking so the zipper would hold. My phone buzzed with texts from friends I thought I knew, some offering help, some offering silence. I looked at the brooch's empty tray, at Claire's face slick with triumph and grief braided together, and I knew something else then, as surely as I knew the suitcase was too light. I knew this would not be a single bad day. It would become the story people used when they wanted to explain me away. I knew I would lose apartments, maybe jobs that required a stable address, and certain people who believed family first and facts later. I knew in that glassed moment before the front door shut behind me that my life had been split into before and after. The after smelled like cold rain on concrete and felt like every door I had once taken for granted closing in my face. The brooch sat in a velvet tray like a ghost of an accusation, and Claire smoothed her hands over her sweater as if she had already sewn the wound closed. I walked out into the rain thinking I would tell my side. That time would make what came next fair. But the house went quiet behind me in a way that said they had already decided what fairness looked like. They gathered like a jury long before anyone said the word guilty, every face folded into the expression that had marked my life whenever Claire wanted to be believed. The living room was full of cousins who had shown up for the Sunday roast, of aunts with purses clutched to their chests, of dad sullen and rigid like an old statue, and of mom with red rings around her eyes as if she had been crying from the start and only now allowed herself the fatigue. Claire sat on the sofa like someone who had already rehearsed the ending, her hands folded over the empty velvet tray as if it were a relic she had rescued. I walked into the room holding a small stack of receipts, my phone with location history open, and a ticket stub from the coffee shop where I had been that morning. I thought evidence would feel like a weapon sharpened for my side. Instead, it landed like rain on a roof everyone had already decided to tear down. "You need to explain," my father said without looking at me, his voice low and authoritative, the kind that had once hushed household squabbles and now only served to finalize punishments. He did not ask for my side, he asked for an explanation as if I might perform one and then be forgiven. Claire exhaled and launched into a timeline she had practiced, words clipped and precise as if she were reading off a script. She said I had been in the hallway at 10:17, that I had brushed past the bedroom where Mom kept her jewelry, that I had left in a hurry when she went to make tea. Her eyes never wavered. Her brother, my cousin Luke, nodded as if struck by a revelation he had always known to be true. My aunt crossed her arms and said, "We've all heard these stories before." I told them about the coffee shop, about the barista who would remember my regular order, about the receipt with the time stamped on it. I showed them my phone with the map that pinged where I had been, the little blue dot insulated from the house by miles. I said I loved Mom, that I would never take something of hers, that I had never stolen from anyone who raised me. For every proof I laid on the table, another voice rose to drown it out with a memory that painted me as someone who needed to be removed. "You always did things your own way," my great-uncle said, like a supplication and a condemnation in the same breath. "Always at the edge of trouble." My sister smiled when she said it, like someone admiring a long, ugly pattern. Words became knives. My aunt accused me of entitlement, of living off Mom's goodwill until I got caught. My cousin offered a story about a time I had borrowed money and not paid it back, a debt I had once held then repaid in private. The facts bowed under the weight of the narrative they preferred. A neighbor swore she had seen me walking down the street near the house that morning, though she later admitted it was early and she could not be sure. That admission barely mattered. People want to believe what fits the shapes they already hold. My father said, "You have to go, we can't have this in the house." His voice had the terrible finality of someone closing a book on me. When I asked them to call the police, Mom sniffed and said, "This isn't for the police, this is family." The words were meant to soften the blow, but they cut sharper because they meant I was being judged by people who loved me and had chosen the other side anyway. "You always liked being difficult," my mother said, small and vicious, like someone trying to punish me for a lifetime of small rebellions. My voice cracked when I asked how they could be so sure. Claire leaned forward, one of those lean-ins that announces truth like testimony, and said, "We know him, he was the last person near Mom's things." She didn't look me in the eye, she looked at the room, collecting nods like trophies. There was a moment when my uncle, the one who taught me how to fish, who used to laugh at my terrible jokes, opened his mouth and then closed it again. You could see his hands debating between what he wanted to believe and the shape the room had taken. In another life, he might have asked me a question that could have changed everything. Instead, he silenced himself with a cough and let the verdict live in the air. Someone suggested I leave immediately, that it would be easier for everyone if I packed a bag and didn't make this worse. It was framed as kindness, practical and final. I tried to argue that being forced out without a chance to prove my innocence was not justice. I tried to say that ripping me out of the household would damage Mom as much as me. My protest sounded like a stranger's echo in a church. "We can't have that sort of thing in the family," my aunt said. "People will start to wonder." There was a sudden, ugly kind of self-preservation in her voice that I had not expected from someone who had once knit me a sweater. They feared scandal more than they cared for truth. I felt that like a burning. Then the finality dropped. My father said, "Pack what you need, leave today." The words closed around me like a trapdoor. I had imagined sentences like this in angry moments, but never spoken with the certainty of men who believe themselves right. I felt smaller than a mistake. They handed me a towel from the bathroom as if I were a bad tenant and not their son, as if the years of birthdays, scraped knees, graduations, and dry jokes could be erased with a few curt directives. My sister's face softened for a second, only to harden again when she caught a cousin's approving glance. The room applauded nothing. No one stood up for me, not in a voice loud enough to matter. I left carrying a duffel with too many holes and a heart that sounded like someone had stitched it into a smaller space. The door closed behind me with that terrible, ordinary thud that marks the end of every family I had ever known. As I walked down the drive, rain starting again like a punctuated sentence, I could still hear Claire say, "I never thought you'd stoop so low." The pain of that sting was more than the loss of a brooch. It was the way my people had become judges who wanted closure more than truth. I realized then that exile was not just a physical thing. It was a social erasure, a refusal to let the world remember me as anything but the story they had chosen. I had been disowned with the efficiency of a committee, and they had done it to themselves and to me. I learned quickly how a single accusation can act like acid, eating through everything it touches until the shape of your life is unrecognizable. The first week after I packed my duffel and walked away, people stopped calling. My boss at the small event company where I coordinated weddings and corporate dinners sent a curt email saying the company had to distance itself from any controversy. No call, no meeting, just corporate PR language that meant my name and my years of loyalty could be erased with a template. contracts vanished. Couples who had trusted me to design their days asked for refunds and other planners. When I answered one email with a receipt proving I had been across town that morning, the sender replied, "This isn't about logistics, it's about trust." It was the coldest, most efficient death I had known. Friends turned into strangers with a single scroll. Someone posted a photo of Claire looking distraught beside the empty jewelry tray and tagged half the town. Within hours, comments spun a web of assumptions. "I heard he had been irresponsible for years," one cousin wrote. "Family first," said another, and friends I had stayed up with through breakups and moves used the family line like a shield to shut me out. Jack, who had been my roommate for 3 years and who knew where I slept when work burned me out, sent one line, "Not taking sides, but this is messy." He unfriended me later that week. The strikes were small and merciless answers I used to give and advice I used to ask for now stopped existing. People who owed me phone calls remembered instead to send condolences to my parents. Online, the story became a rumor with legs, and each new retelling made me less of a son and more of a character in an explosive gossip piece. Without work, money shrank like something put in the dryer without permission. Landlords, like predators smelling weakness, found reasons to evict me from the cheap studio I had finally afforded after years of living hand to mouth. Unruly neighbor complaints, they said, even though I had been the one who called about the leak. I slept on couches for a while, then on the floor of friends who had more compassion than courage to keep me. I learned the humiliating arithmetic of kindness, how many nights someone could spare before their lives filled up again, and even kind people had to protect their own family routines. In the mornings, I would ride the train and open my phone to a map of all the places I used to belong and realize the blue dot of my life had nowhere steady to land. I started taking odd jobs, heavy lifting, stacking boxes at a warehouse for minimum wage because pride eats before hunger. My hands became calloused in a way that made me feel connected to something honest, if only for 8 hours a day. At night, I would sit in the library until it closed, charging my phone in a cubicle that smelled faintly of printer toner and old coffee. Some nights I cried in the bathrooms until it felt like a ritual, scraping the sound out of my chest and flushing it down the sink. The shame isn't the kind you can name cleanly. It crept into odd places, into how I smiled at strangers, into how I avoided looking at mothers with brooches when I passed them in stores. I started checking my reflection for the face I had before the accusation, searching for the boy who knew how to fix a bicycle tire and bake a terrible cake for mom's birthdays. There was anger, of course, a bright, dangerous thing that kept me awake and filled my mouth with plans I never had the stomach to execute. I pictured walking back to the house and smashing the tray, or burning Claire's things, or taking a sledgehammer to the family portraits. Most nights I negotiated with that fury, laying rules like bones: no violence, no public spectacle, no escalation that would make me the headline I was trying to demolish. I remember one sleepless dawn watching a city bus drive by with an advertisement of a smiling family packed into the image and thinking how manufactured and false that perfect smile looked compared to the raw fissures of my life. Sometimes the fury felt like fuel, other times it felt like another weight to carry. The smallest cruelties were the ones that landed hardest. Friends who avoided my calls because my name brought awkwardness to holiday plans, a former boss who called to say he couldn't be seen supporting me, and a former landlord who mentioned, almost apologetically, that neighborhood chatter had made keeping me untenable. I tried to fight back with truth. I asked a lawyer friend for advice and learned legal fees were a private war I could not afford. The lawyer shrugged and said defamation cases are messy when the accuser is a family member with influence. Family alliances are a kind of currency no court likes to challenge if it can be avoided. That line lodged in me, heavy and immovable. Yet within the ruins, there were shards of humanity that kept me breathing. An old waitress at the bus depot named Mara, who I met the day I had nothing else to lose, slid me a warm sandwich and said, "People lie, food doesn't." A retired plumber named Jorge offered me work fixing boilers for cash. He taught me plumbing basics and how to smell the difference between rotten trust and honest labor. They didn't ask for evidence. They offered work and a place to crash in the garage when the rain came hard. Their kindness didn't erase the betrayal, but it built a small scaffold I could stand on between nights of gnawing doubt and the need to make rent on a future I could not yet see. There were darker moments too, evenings when the betrayal felt like a physical presence pressing against my ribs, flattening breath into a whisper. I thought about taking my story public, about screaming my name into the internet until it stuck, but the fear of making Claire an even clever victim kept me quiet. When I lay awake, I recounted the house, the tray, the exact sound of Claire's finger jabbing the air, and wondered how something so precise could be so invented. The question became my quiet companion. It hardened into a small, fierce resolution that would not be audible yet, but would sit under my ribs like a seed. I would not let them be the only authors of my life. The road was ugly, the nights were long, and my reputation was a tattered flag fluttering on a broken pole, but somewhere under the wreckage, something like a plan began to take shape. Years blurred together like pages in a book I was only reading for the footnotes, but the slow lines of life reassembled themselves into something I recognized. I stayed with Jorge off and on for months, sleeping in the garage when storms hit and taking shifts fixing boilers and patching pipes for cash. Those winters taught me a kind of honest exhaustion I had never known in office jobs, the kind where your body complains but your head clears and you can see the progress you have made with your own hands. I learned how to solder without burning my thumb as often, how to read a rust stain like a paragraph telling you where the leak began, and how a clogged drain can be a small, fixable disaster rather than a testament to your worth. Little by little, wages patched the holes in my life. Mara found me a night shift at the diner behind the bus depot where I learned to make perfect eggs and listen without judgment. It was in that noisy, greasy place that I realized kindness could be transactional and generous at the same time. People paid me in tips and conversation, in a place at the counter when I had nowhere else to sit. I started saving, like one saves for a storm that might never come but should be honored nonetheless. And when I had enough to buy a beat-up van that leaked at the corners, I fixed it up with Jorge's guidance. The van became my office and my salvation. Its back was a toolbox and my calling card. I did odd jobs, residential and then commercial, and slowly let the word of mouth take the place of a resume. People liked that I showed up on time, that I apologized when a job ran late, that I left a note when I'd done the work. The kind of reputation you can't buy glues to you in small acts, sweeping dust from the floor, refilling the neighbor's coffee when you spill it, returning a small item found in a couch. I learned to be patient with people who were impatient because I had once needed them to be patient with me, and they rarely were. Those tiny self-improvements added up into a business card, then a license, then the kind of steady work that meant I could afford my own room again. Along the way I met Lena in the most unromantic of places, a community center donation drive where I was fixing a leaky faucet and she was dropping off boxes of baby clothes. She had a kid, a smart, quiet girl with my mother's crooked smile and a laugh that somehow knew things before I did. Our first conversation was about patching the old playroom ceiling, the second was about bad coffee, and by the third we were bartering childcare for plumbing help. She didn't ask for my life story, and that was both terrifying and liberating. I gave it to her slowly, like amber for preservation, and she listened in the way that matters, not waiting to speak but waiting to understand. We built a life with careful beams, shared bills, a small two-bedroom above a bakery, a dog named Stitch who liked to steal socks and lay them under the bed like a fanfare of minor crimes. Lena and I got married on a rainy afternoon with jars of lemonade and a playlist on a battered Bluetooth speaker. It felt less like a statement and more like choosing to be the person who made coffee at 3 a.m. when someone needed it. The life we made was redemptive in the small domestic way. Mail that arrived under our name, a garden I could not kill, the kind of bills that reminded me I had a place to make them. I found peace in unexpected pockets. At open mic nights where I told stories and watched strangers lean in, at the hardware store where the owner finally listed me first for the bulk discount because I had been reliable, and in therapy, which I started after Lena refused to let me sleepwalk through triggers any longer. Talking about it with a professional didn't erase the betrayal, but it shined a light on the fissures so they could be cleaned and remortared. I learned to name the panic, finger-pointing, raised voices, the smell of my sister's perfume, and call it by a safer word. I set boundaries with my family. Calls came once in a while, stiff and wrapped in the old assumptions. I didn't answer all of them. Saying no to a person whose trust had been broken felt like a reclaiming of my own dignity. The scar was there, a place on my chest that tightened when Claire's name appeared on my phone, when a family photo came up on social media with her smiling in it. Some nights it throbbed, some days it was a dull ache I could live around. Professionally, things turned a corner when I started a small repair co-op with two other guys I had worked with on nights and weekends. We called it Secondhand Fix, which was equal parts humor and mission statement. We offered discounted rates for single parents, veterans, and anyone starting over. Word spread, not because we shouted, but because someone who had a leaky roof and a soft heart told their neighbor, and then the neighbor told 10 more. People who had once known me as the one from the rumor began to know me as the guy who left clean receipts and a stamped guarantee. My name stopped being shorthand for trouble and became attached to a van that arrived with a polite knock. I was offered steady contracts with a local nonprofit that renovated safe houses for women escaping violence. The work felt meaningful the way filling potholes in a road you walk on every day feels meaningful, real, necessary, and sometimes thankless. And yet the scar remained, a quiet, watchful thing. I slept with one eye half open for years, wary of entrances and sudden accusations. I still flinched when someone raised a hand in earnest conversation. Holidays were a careful choreography. I celebrated the ones I had chosen, avoided the ones I hadn't been invited to, and in private I counted the ways the loss had shaped me. In quieter moments, I would take out the receipts and maps, the little proofs I had collected early on, and feel both gratitude and a lingering hunger for a public exoneration that had never come. I had found peace in the practical, steady work, a family that picked me instead of pointing, but the hurt had taught me a new lesson about truth. Sometimes it waits for years to be found in the most ordinary place. I told myself I would not be the man who lived for revenge, but also that I would not be the man who let a lie become his tombstone. The line between those two things became my road, and on it I learned to walk again. The call came in the middle of a Tuesday when I was elbow-deep in a sink someone had promised me wouldn't be that clogged. My hands were smelling of old soap and rust, and I answered on instinct because I still answer my mother's number even when I tell myself not to. "It's your father," she said before I could get hello out, her voice like paper folded too many times. There was a tremor in it I had never heard except once when my grandfather died. For a second I thought something had happened to someone else, a neighbor or a grandparent. Then my mother said, "They found it. They found the brooch." The words were soft, absurdly precise, like a magician finally revealing the trick. She told me the story in fits and starts, each piece sounding more ridiculous than the last. It wasn't a dramatic police raid or a tearful confession. It was a volunteer at the church thrift drive, Mrs. Klein, who had been sorting through a bin of donated winter scarves the day after the drive. Mrs. Klein had found something caught in the crochet of a thick navy scarf, something shiny that fell into her palm when she tugged a stray yarn. It was the brooch, the sapphire one with the tiny diamonds that had become a punctuation mark in our family. I could hear my mother's inhale through the phone, that wet sound that meant she was about to apologize and didn't yet have the strength to finish the sentence. "Only Claire donated those scarves," my father said, and for a beat his voice was a child's, small and unsteady because the logic was brutally simple. He explained that Claire had been in charge of collecting winter things at her office, had packed them into bags and taken them to the church herself. She'd taken them from the back of her car. She'd wrapped them in the same navy scarf because it was cold and she liked that one. The image in my head of Claire stooping over the bin, folding scarves into a neat stack as people walked by, made the rest of the story feel too cinematic to breathe. "And Mrs. Klein," my mother went on, "found a Polaroid tucked into the hem next to the brooch." My knees went soft. A Polaroid. My mother described it slowly, like an older person reading a recipe out loud so no one burns the cake. The volunteer had unfolded the tiny square and there was Claire in it, smiling, hair clipped back, the brooch fastened to her sweater. On the white border our mother's handwriting had once taught me to recognize by feel there was a date, 2 days after the theft, and a scribble in the corner that was definitively Claire's shorthand. My mother said the volunteer had recognized the handwriting because Claire had once donated knitted mittens with a little tag in the same ink. The scarf itself had a monogram hidden in the weave, a small C stitched in the corner in the exact looping way Claire had learned in a home economics class and teased me about for years. Hearing those things listed off felt like watching a slow close on a camera that refused to blink away. It was absurd, the way truth sometimes falls out of the world in the most ordinary places. A brooch falling out of a donated scarf is something that belongs in a sitcom where everyone eventually forgives over tea. In my throat, there was a wild thing that wanted to laugh at how theatrical it all was. Why would you hide a brooch in a scarf you were giving away? Why would you keep a Polaroid of yourself wearing it? The answers packed too close to the surface to be comfortable. Because you wanted to prove you had it, because you wanted the accusation to stick, but also wanted the trophy to show you had pulled it off. Because you wanted me gone and wanted the story to be tidy. My mother asked me to come home. There was a brittle apology in her voice that broke into pieces when she tried to say the words I had waited years for. She started. "We were wrong," she managed, and the sentence ended like a dropped stone. For a second I didn't know whether to breathe in or out. Part of me wanted to slam the receiver down and collect every legal scrap I had hoarded and run to the church to demand answers. Another part of me ached with a long hunger for a parent's full-throated apology, for the sort of cleansing that could not be rushed. They said Mrs. Klein had brought the scarf and the Polaroid to the parish office, and they had called my parents because the scarf had the monogram. My father told me almost in confession that he had gone to the church and seen the photo himself, saw Claire's grin like a small victory, and felt his stomach tighten with something that might be guilt or might be recognition. He'd asked how it got there, and the volunteer had said, "Only the person who packed the donation bag could have sewn that hem the way it's done." I recognized that stitch. Hearing my mother's voice repeat a volunteer's assessment tightened a knot in my chest between relief and a new kind of rage. The evidence was absurd and beautiful and final in its ordinariness. I asked if they had called the police. My father said they had, but quietly, without a statement yet, as if the idea of opening that door felt like tearing fresh stitches. My mother begged me through 1,000 ragged breaths to come home for dinner to let them show me the Polaroid. I told them I'd come, but my feet felt heavy and strange, like something inside me had been moved and would never quite sit the same way again. On the train, I pictured the scarf in slow motion, the navy yarn, the stuck brooch, that Polaroid with my sister's smug, triumphant smile. The absurdity of it made me want to laugh with the kind of bitter joy that scares people. That scarf, that photo, the tiny monogram, all of it slipped together into a proof so simple it hurt. And underneath the hurt, there was a new, different kind of hunger. For the reckoning that would follow, for the apologies that would have to be bigger than words, and for the long, messy work of making people see me again as I was, not as a story they preferred. The discovery was ridiculous and incriminating in equal measure, and I carried it like a live coal in my chest as I walked through a city that had once been my home and was now a waiting place for whatever came next. They came at me like a series of small storms, each apology softer and weaker than the last, all designed to land without really changing the landscape. The first was a message from my mother, a text that started with "I'm so sorry" and then laced itself through excuses about how she had been so worried and didn't want to make things worse. It read like someone who had been practicing guilt more than contrition. My father called and his voice wavered between regret and indignation, as if he were ashamed of having been fooled but angrier that anyone had suggested he could be wrong. Claire sent a letter with flowery sentences that never used the word liar, never admitted intention, and curled back to the central theme: please come home. The house apparently was still a place that belonged to them, and now they wanted me back to complete the picture they'd been missing for years. They scheduled things like it was a campaign. My aunt organized a Sunday brunch that was code for a reconciliation meeting. She lined the table with scones and pity and invited distant cousins who had once nodded along to Claire's stories. My uncle, the quiet one who used to teach me to carve wood, showed up with his hands shaking and a short apology that ended with "we're all human." He kept looking at me as if I might forgive him on cue. There were flowers left on my doorstep with notes written in shaky cursive, and then there were the performative gestures. A Facebook post from my mother with a grainy photo of the family tree and the caption "Family is complicated. Forgiveness begins." It was public, so it counted, but it was as thin as tissue paper. Apology had been turned into an instrument for repairing their image, not healing me. Claire's apology tour was the most theatrical. She posted a video, hands trembling, in which she spoke about panic and shame and about how she had made a terrible mistake. She cried on cue, and the lighting made her look remorseful in a way that had been absent in the kitchen that day she pointed her finger. But she managed to avoid the parts I needed: the reason she put the brooch in a scarf she donated, the Polaroid, the way she had watched the house fall and not stepped in. Instead, she talked about messy emotions and the need to move forward and asked me to please just accept our apology. I watched it once and then watched it again, counting the ways someone could say "I'm sorry" without actually saying the words that would mean something. I did this to hurt you, and I am prepared to make amends publicly and privately. They tried bargaining. My father offered money in an envelope left at Lena's door like a bribe disguised as help, an attempt to smooth the path home by turning my need into a ledger entry they could balance. My aunt promised to host community events clearing my name if I would just come to family dinners again. Claire called Lena and pressed the idea that coming home would be good for our kid, that we owed the family a chance to mend. Her voice was honeyed and urgent. She wanted to reclaim the narrative, to fold me back into the family portrait where she remained the center. The moment was bizarrely transactional: buy back the son with casseroles and kind words and maybe a job at the family shop. They believed wrongly that sentiment could replace accountability. I told them I would not be placated by performative shame. I gave them a list of conditions that was merciless in its simplicity: a public correction on the same channels they had used to spread rumor, one-on-one apologies to the people who had been hurt by Claire's lie, an acknowledgement that what happened had deeply damaged me beyond the inconvenience of being wronged, and concrete help with any legal or emotional costs they'd caused. They flinched at the practical things. They sighed about feelings and didn't like commitments that required paperwork and action. My mother cried and said she felt guilty, and that was the thing they kept circling back to: their guilt like a blanket they wanted me to wrap around them so I would feel better while they remained warm. There were arguments, small explosions where all the old scripts got dragged into the light. My cousin Luke called me a drama king over a voicemail that was half apology and half sentence about how this has affected the whole family. He wanted me to be reasonable, to understand the pressure they had been under, as if pressure absolved deliberate acts. Claire tried to hug me in public at the church, tears leaking down her cheeks, and I moved away as if from a hot stove. There was a deadness in me then that surprised even me, the realization that an embrace could be an accusation in itself. I found myself wanting to force the apology into terms that made it visible. A video in which Claire said the words I needed to hear, a letter she signed in front of witnesses, a deposition where she would say, on record, why she did it. A twist came when Mrs. Klein, the volunteer who found the scarf, reached out and said she would testify to the church's small committee that had gathered to sort the donations. She wanted nothing to do with family drama but could not keep quiet about the Polaroid and the monogram. That detail made some relatives start to sweat because the evidence was not just a suggestion anymore. It was a paper trail that could be followed. My parents' apologies then grew more frantic and more theatrical, as if the possibility of a witness had turned their sorrow into panic. They began to promise things they perhaps had not planned to deliver, public statements, offers to help my business, promises of inclusion, but their voices still trembled around themselves. They wanted me back for the picture, while Mrs. Klein's quiet clarity demanded something else, truth without convenient endings. I watched all of it and felt my peace teeter. Part of me wanted to swallow the apology and be a son again for the sake of quiet dinners and grandmother's meatloaf. Part of me wanted the apology to be so public and so humiliating that Claire would be forced to see herself as I did. In the end, I refused their half measures. I told them I would accept them back into my life only after they did the work they kept avoiding, public, specific, and accountable. I wanted restitution, not theatrical contrition. When my mother sobbed into the phone that they were destroyed by guilt, I told her I had been destroyed too and that their guilt was not a currency I could spend. Their tour of teary faces was pathetic because it made the apology about saving themselves and not about the man they had broken and the life they had tried to bury. I told them I would come, but I set the rules like a contract. Claire had to be there, Mrs. Klein had to be invited, and there had to be witnesses who would not let the moment evaporate into another polite domestic lie. They agreed because they wanted the scene fixed, and I agreed because I wanted the truth out in daylight where no one could tuck it back into the dark. We met in the parish hall because it was neutral, because Mrs. Klein volunteered there, and because the fluorescent lights gave everything the flat honesty of an interrogation room. My hands were steady in a way that surprised me. Either I had practiced this moment for years in the quiet of my chest, or the possibility of hearing the truth at last had a kind of surgical calm to it. Claire arrived last, hair pulled tight into a ponytail, face scrubbed of the practiced grief she used for cameras. She looked smaller than in the photos they'd fed the town, and the soft edges of her looked like the costume had been stripped away. My parents sat on one side, eyes bleary and raw with the math of their mistakes, and across from them sat Aunt Marlene, who had always loved tidy stories. Mrs. Klein carried an elderly purse and set the navy scarf on the table like sacred evidence, the Polaroid beside it like the dumbest, most damning postcard. For a long minute no one spoke, and the hall smelled faintly of coffee and waxed floors, ordinary smells that made the scene feel obscene. Claire started with deflection like a practiced actor. "I never meant for I panicked," she said at first, hands twisting like fishing lines. She used 100 words that meant nothing and avoided the ones I needed, stole, framed, enjoyed. My father tried to steer the moment with the voice of a man who wanted closure more than truth, but when he looked at Claire, there was a flicker that told me he wanted him returned as much as I wanted to be righted. I pushed gently at first, asking her to explain why the brooch had been worn in that Polaroid and why it was hidden in the scarf she donated. She told small lies, then contradicted herself, and the small contradictions started to feel like cracks in glass. The real confession came like a slow unravel, a thing that couldn't be stopped once it started. She laughed at one point, an abrupt, embarrassed sound, and then it was as if something inside her had decided the performance was over. She looked straight at me and the mask slipped. "I put it in my pocket," she said quietly, and the room inhaled. "I took it. I needed," the word fell out like a stone and made a small splash. She told us then, in a voice that trembled with something like shame and something like relief, why she had done it. The motive wasn't cinematic. It was petty, human, and ugly enough to hurt. She wanted control. She said she had been tired of being the background actress in our parents' lives, tired of people treating me like the troubled second son who could be dismissed with a shrug. She had been passed over at work, her boyfriend had left for someone who looked less like a charity case, and she had been sitting on a small, growing debt that made her anxious at night. The brooch, she admitted, was the perfect tool, valuable, portable, and shaming if missing. Taking it gave her the thrill of power, the authority to create a narrative where she could be the wounded party and I could be the villain. She told us she wanted the house to reorganize around her, to be seen as the one who protected Mom, to be the obvious heir in a world that had never given her that role on merit. She described the first day as small and clinical. Slipping the brooch into her pocket after dusting the tray, the cool weight like a secret in her palm, the ridiculous gratuitousness of wearing it the next day under a sweater just to feel it there. She took the Polaroid not as evidence but as proof for herself, a trophy to look at on nights she felt small. Later, when paranoia crept in and the house hummed with suspicion, she said she set the brooch inside the navy scarf and tucked the scarf into a donation bag on purpose, intending Mrs. Klein or some volunteer to find it and thereby close the loop on her story. That is, to make the brooch reappear in a place that would make her claim airtight. She confessed she did not expect anyone to check for a monogram or to notice the Polaroid. Then the part that made my stomach drop harder than any accusation. She admitted she had watched me leave. She admitted, with a kind of sick fascination she couldn't hide, that she had enjoyed the house rearranging around her absence, that the soft, sudden attention she received afterward scratched an ache she had carried all her life. "I wanted it," she said, voice low and thin, "and when it worked, I couldn't stop thinking about how easy it had been." The words were small and monstrous together, a private logic that explained everything and nothing. Mrs. Klein, who had listened quietly with the unflappable patience of someone who'd spent decades sorting other people's cast-offs, looked at Claire and said only, "Why?" Claire's answer was thin like a thread. "Because I could." There was a kind of end-of-a-movie silence after that, an emptiness that wasn't relief so much as the sound made when a piece of machinery stops and cannot be restarted. I felt 1,000 things at once: vindication, a cold rage that settled into my bones, and a grief that was more physical than emotional. The confession was pathetic and final, and I heard it for what it was. The confession of someone who had wanted the narrative to fit her, who had chosen cruelty as a shortcut to importance. My parents began to cry in earnest then, and their apologies came in waves of broken syllables that felt too late. Claire kept weeping in a way that was both genuine and performative, like a child who had finally realized the gravity of what she'd done, but had no map for repair. I thought of the years I'd spent rebuilding, of the nights I slept in garages and the small kindnesses that had kept me alive, and of the way my life had been overwritten by a lie that took pleasure in my exile. The confession landed and did not heal. It provided proof, yes, but also exposed a deeper rot, that someone I loved had put her needs above my life and had never truly seen me as a person. The room smelled like coffee and old paper and something like the end of a long, bad story. And I sat there deciding, in the quiet that followed, what justice would look like now that the truth was finally out. When Claire's words finally stopped rattling around the parish hall and the coffee cups cooled on the table, there was a kind of raw brightness in the room like an exposed bulb. People sat looking embarrassed and small and circular in their shame, and I felt something else flare up inside me, an old muscle that remembered how to breathe properly again. I had come with rules because I knew how easily moments like this could be smoothed over with perfume and casseroles. I had seen their apologies roll out like weathered flags, designed to make them feel lighter and not to unburden me. I had heard Claire call what she did a mistake and watched her blink like someone surprised by the sound of her own voice. So I let the silence hold long enough for the truth to sink into the air, slow and irreversible. I told them first that I accepted the fact they were sorry. Saying it aloud felt strange because acceptance and forgiveness are not the same thing. Acceptance is acknowledging a fact. Forgiveness is handing someone back what they broke. I said I accepted that they had been lied to, that they had been hurt, that they had been part of the machinery that threw me out. That admission made faces fold in on themselves like paper being refolded. But then I said what I knew to be true and what they had yet to reckon with. The theft was bigger than a brooch. The brooch had been the symptom, not the crime. The crime had been the theft of my life, the years taken from me by the accusation, the nights I slept in strangers' garages, the jobs I lost, the friendships that rotted away because people preferred the easiest story. That was the real robbery, and there is no returning the hours people stole by choosing a version of me that fit a narrative they favored. They asked me, with the sort of desperate pleading that apologies often disguise, what I wanted. My answer surprised even me. I did not want their pity arranged nicely on a Sunday plate. I did not want a tidy reentry into a home where whispers could start again over second helpings. I wanted concrete things because concrete can be used as leverage against laziness. A public retraction on the same platforms they'd used to spread the rumor, posted with the same reach and sincerity they had given the original accusation. Proof that Claire would accept accountability beyond performative tears. A written statement signed and made public, confessing intentionally and outlining steps she would take, including counseling and community service for a year at the church where the scarf had been donated. And a visible offer to help repair what they had broken, including financial assistance to cover the tangible losses I could prove, lost work, legal consultations I could never afford, and the small business credit I had to take out to keep second-hand fix afloat in the early days. I wanted them to show me that their apologies were not for themselves, but for the damage they had done to someone they called family. My father looked like a man who had been hit by a recurring tidal wave. He wanted to hold on to the shape of his household and still be its judge. My mother folded in on herself, the way people do when they are asked to look at the thing they have not wanted to see. Claire's face flickered between contrition and calculation. For a beat I allowed myself the satisfaction of watching them wrestle with the idea that apology might be transactional, that it might cost them something more than a tearful post. They agreed to my conditions with the sort of slow obedience that comes when you know you have no other route home. They promised in measured, careful voices to make the statements I asked for, to help my business recoup some of its early losses, and to ensure Claire would start therapy and community work that was verifiable and public. I don't say that to gloat. I say it because some accountability had to be demanded, otherwise their remorse would have been nothing more than sound. Even after they promised, I could feel the gash they had left. Time isn't something you can stitch back. There is a weight to years you live in exile, relationships that never remade themselves, opportunities that left the station without you, a boyish trust that hardened into suspicion. I told them I would not come home. I told them that the house they loved had been made on the bones of a lie, and that to walk back in would be to sign my name to a future where I would always be on the defensive, waiting for that finger to point again. I wanted my life back, not a version of it that sat politely next to their discomfort. My refusal to return was not grandstanding. It was a boundary set in the only place that felt honest. If we were to be a family again, it would have to be in a form that did not require me to fold away the scars for someone else's comfort. There was a sharpness to saying no that I had not expected. It felt like leaving a room and letting the door click behind me in a house that would keep the echo of the past but not my presence. Claire tried to reach for me then, the old reflex still hungry, but I moved away as I had done before, only this time I didn't flinch afterward. I had something they did not, years of building, of tending to small kindnesses, of being chosen by people who trusted me because I earned that trust. I was not unwilling to be in their lives in small, controlled ways. Letters answered, a holiday text perhaps, but not the wholesale abandon of the man I had been. That version of me had belonged to a house that believed in tidy narratives over messy truth. Before I walked out of the parish hall, I did one small, final thing that made the moment feel like a kind of justice. I asked that the brooch be donated to a local charity auction, not for money to return to us, but to fund a small legal aid foundation for people who are falsely accused by those they love. People who, like me, lose livelihoods and reputations to stories others choose for them. My father balked at that. He wanted to keep the brooch as a family relic once the dust settled. But my mother, with that new, trembling clarity that sometimes arrives late, agreed. She understood that letting the brooch sit on a velvet tray would be like keeping a scar on display. Giving it away turned it into work that might prevent another life being stolen. When I left, my shoulders felt unexpected and new. I didn't have vindication in loudness. I had a quiet, stubborn settling of my own bones. Walking away was not a running from pain, but a stepping toward a life I had earned in mud and small mercies. The family had offered apologies and would do the work I required, but they could not compensate for the nights and the trust and the years. That count would remain an honest ledger. I felt free not because I was forgiven into the old role, but because I had finally told the truth of my life out loud and refused to let it be edited back into a lie I no longer recognized. I stepped into the street, the city breathing around me, and for the first time in a long time I breathed back.